that tonight.
Yes, but happy beginning of February, imaginary creature lovers. It's Miss Lynn coming back with you for another week of fun with people from the Norse and the Norse gods. Here we see Thor again with his hammer, and my oh my, I loved the hammers that so many of you drew. I had no idea we had so many wonderful artists in our classes. They were just spectacular. I loved seeing them, and thank you so much for sharing them with the class. This is a great artist illustration of Thor here riding across the skies with his two goats, and don't they look fierce? And they have really interesting names too. They're called Tooth Gnasher and Tooth Grinder. Aren't those great names? And they were said that if they went across the sky, as they went across the sky, they I'll show you the backside here of one of them. Going across, you can see him going across the backside. There he is riding on the back, just whooshing past us here. And the two giant goats, you can see them right here too in this picture. Tooth Gnasher and Tooth Grinder. It was their hoofs that people heard when it thundered on earth. And he controlled, we talked about this last week, the thunder and the lightning. And he brewed up storms by blowing through his beard. You can see on this other picture that I showed you, his very big beard there. Now, I think I mentioned last week that this Mjolnir, the hammer that he had, was pretty magical, that he would throw it and it would come back to him, that he was very, very strong. And one of the things that he could do was he could bring things back to life by waving it over things. And so one of the stories that you're going to hear today is a very interesting story and that has two parts to it. And the first part of it is he goes and he visits a very, very poor couple that have no food at all. And so what he actually does is he actually kills Tooth Grinder and Tooth Gnasher so that they can eat them for dinner, but knowing all along that he can bring them back to life. So what he does is he says, but what we have to do is you need to make sure that you save all the skin and all the bones, and we're going to lay it all out and make sure we save it all so that the next day he's going to wave this Mjolnir over it, his magic hammer, and bring it back to life. But you're going to find that something goes wrong because one of the children in the family just loves bone marrow. And I don't know if you've ever like taken a chicken bone and snapped it in two, but when you look at the inside of it, you can kind of suck out the middle part of it, and that's called the bone marrow. And one of the children loved to suck out bone marrow, and so that's what he did. And so when Thor went to put back they put all the bones and all the skin, laid them all out, and when he went to put the Tooth Gnasher and Tooth Grinder together again, well, one of their back legs was lame because this boy he put the bones back in, but one of the bones was broken, and so this this goat had a lame back leg, and Thor was so angry he was going to kill those children right on the spot. But the father went and begged for their lives, and so it appeased Thor's anger. And so what he did instead was he said, okay, fine, I won't kill them, but they have to come along with me and be my servants. And so that was the bargain. So that's the first part of the story that you're going to hear tell in the video that's coming up. And then as they are going to the king of the giants, the land where the king of the giants lives, and his name is Utgard Loki. Not to be confused with Loki, who is another character in the story, who is the little tiny kind of mischievous guy that we talked about last week. But Utgard Loki is the king of all the giants. So we will hear that very interesting story that has some twists and turns in it, and is told, by the way, by my son, Ian, who is a father himself and who loves to tell stories to his children who are about your age. And he loves Norse stories and about the Norse gods. So that's kind of a fun thing that he put that together for you, especially. Now, the other story that I wanted to read to you today is a very interesting story about a horse, a magic horse. You remember Odin is the father of Thor, and he gets pretty jealous about a horse because he wanted this magical horse that Thor has. So how did that happen? Well, here's a really cool picture, isn't it? And this story is called Thor's Headache. Let's find out about that. One day, Odin went looking for adventure in Jotunheim on his fantastic horse, Sleipnir. The giant Hrungnir saw him coming and was very impressed by Sleipnir. He challenged Odin to a race against his own horse, Gulfaxi. Odin accepted. The horses were a good match, and Hrungnir was so busy racing that he did not realize they were heading straight for Asgard. They were over the wall into the home of the gods before he knew it. See, the giants were not gods. So he was in foreign territory now. Hrungnir was sure he had been led into a trap, but Odin seemed very friendly and offered him a drink. The gods were scandalized to see a giant in Asgard. Odin warned them not to harm an unarmed guest. Hrungnir began to relax and enjoy himself. He drank as much as the Valkyries could bring him and began to drink and get very rowdy. Odin began to feel that the giant was getting out of hand. He sent for Thor, who was indignant at Hrungnir's behavior and would have dealt swiftly with him, but Hrungnir was quick to point out that it would be cowardly for Thor to kill him, as he had no weapon. Thor restrained himself, but arranged to meet Hrungnir in single combat at another time. So he challenged him to a duel, basically. The day of the duel came, and the enemies faced each other. Thor hurled Mjolnir at the giant, and there it is, right there, see? The hammer shattered at the Hrungnir held up a huge whetstone, which he used to sharpen his tools as a shield. The hammer shattered the whetstone, and one of the sharp flying chips entered Thor's head. He fell wounded, but Mjolnir reached its mark despite the whetstone shield, and Hrungnir was killed. He fell dead on top of Thor. The gods tried to pull Thor from under the giant, but could not shift him. Thor ordered his servant Thialfi, remember that was the boy I was telling you about that ended up having to be Thor's servant. So he ordered his servant to go to the giantess Jarnaxa. She was an ally of the gods, and she and Thor had a son called Magni. He was only 3 years old, but already had the combined strength of his parents. Magni freed Thor easily. Thor was delighted with his son and gave him Hrungnir's horse, which was called Gulfaxi, in thanks. This offended Odin, who had fancied the horse for himself. You remember that's why they were doing the race in the first place, because they wanted to try to race to win the horse from the other person. So this offended Odin, who had fancied the horse for himself. Odin made Thor pay for this later, From then on, the chip that had gone from the whetstone, like one of these little chips, into Thor's head gave him headaches, terrible headaches for the rest of his life. So that's the interesting story about how Thor ended up with this very magical horse that used to belong to Hrungnir. Now, I'll tell you one more story about, you see, we ended this story with how Odin was very jealous of the fact that Thor ended up getting this horse and giving it to his son for helping him by unburying him from this big, huge giant. Well, so what happened then in the end? How did Odin get back at his son? Well, I'll tell you, there's this interesting little story called Thor and the Ferryman. Thor was always more popular than Odin, and this story helps to explain that in a little bit. Odin was annoyed with Thor. He wanted that magic horse that Thor had, which we just talked about. Thor gave it to his son instead of offering it to Odin. Later, Thor was trudging wearily home after a hard fight against the trolls when he came to a swollen river. It was too deep to wade, and Thor found a ferryman and asked him for a ride. The ferryman said his name was Harbard. He soon proved most unpleasant. He would not take Thor on board and told him that his mother was dead and his wife had run off with a mortal. Then he began to poke fun at a god who lost his temper and began to shout. He yelled and boasted about his brave deeds, but each time the ferryman had a better story. Thor realized the ferryman did not mean to take him across and stormed off. He had to walk miles to a ford. A ford is a smaller, shallow place to go across. Back in Asgard, he found his mother well and his wife faithful as ever. He never discovered that Harbard was Odin in disguise. This was how Odin took out his spite over the horse. So Odin was really this ferryman who was just telling all of these stories and not letting him across the river and tricking him. He had just been this ferryman in disguise, and the long and the short of it was that because of all that, Thor had to go all this long, long way around instead of getting a short ride across this river where it was too deep. So that was Odin's spiteful way of trying to get back at his son for not giving him this horse that he wanted. So these gods that the Norse people made up had very real personalities. They had very real, although they were larger than life in so many ways and had magical things that made them even stronger, they had very personable and real characteristics like jealousy and anger and love and justice. So they put very personal also characteristics onto these gods. And that's, I think, what gives them appeal to us. And we still like listening to their stories for that very reason. So later, you're going to listen to one more story. If you look in the link down below, you'll see another story. And then below that, I'm putting another link to an art hub for kids that's how to draw horses, because I thought maybe you might like to draw Thor's horse that he gave to his son. And that would be a really fun thing for me to see. If you go ahead and draw one of those magic horses that belong to Thor or Odin. Let's see if we can hear some pretty pictures of those horses and how spectacular they were. So I thought that this week you might want to have a go at drawing some horses. And I think horses are always great fun to draw. And I think that they do a really great job at the Art Hub with helping you to draw horses. So if you draw a horse this week, post it for us and we'd all love to see it. And I certainly would love to see it. So I hope you have a great week and watch the other video. And I'll love to look forward to seeing your other drawings too. I'll see you next time. Bye.